Mixing with Mike, plugin of the week is the brainworx BX Master Desk. This is a new plugin from the Plugin Alliance and brainworx, and a very cool one. The primary design of this was to give you a professional quality analog style mastering solution for people who don't want to get into all the nuts and bolts of what it takes to be a great mastering engineer or do a great mastering job. And so that's something, if you're a mix engineer and maybe you don't have the budget to have outside mastering, or you're just kind of doing it yourself, this could be a really great solution. Sounds really amazing. It embodies 20 years of mastering, professional mastering experience, and those settings are sort of embedded inside the plugin itself. So it's part sort of emulations of existing analog equipment. It has a very analog style sound to it, gives you all the basic controls that you need, and it simplifies a lot of the functions that can be sort of mysterious. So you may not know exactly what all the frequencies are in the tone section, or how the THD, the harmonic distortion, is created and all of that, but you could still operate the plugin in a very meaningful and simple way, and that's the primary design. So much so that if we go through an overview, the actual steps in the process are kind of spelled out: 1 volume, 2 foundation, 3 tone, and you could kind of work with it from that perspective. So what you have is a gain control that drives the amount of processing. You have compression section here. The foundation is basically establishing the overall bass treble balance. The tone control allows you to set a fundamental tonal character or sound, so you don't have the specific frequencies, but you can kind of work that along with the resonant filters. The resonant filters help to sort of do a little dip at certain frequency areas that are sometimes problematic in mastering. On the top end, it's like a little over 3.150K and 6666 hertz as our or 6.6K frequency there. That's kind of defines a couple of different harshness areas. So you get a little bit of dip there and then a boost around it. So it kind of shifts the energy to a more palatable level for your ear, or section for your ear. Similar type of thing on the low end, where you could do a little bit of a dip in an area that helps to separate the kick drum from some of the softer bass instruments or low end instruments, and that can help to drop the low end to give you a little bit more size in the mix. So you have those controls. You have an MS control here, which is a mono maker. That's the classic brainworx function you find in many of their plugins, especially all their mastering grade plugins. The mono maker monos up low frequencies below the cutoff points. If you set it to 61, everything below 61 will get sent to the center channel. There's also a stereo enhance. This is an interesting feature. It's not just a simple mid-side balance control where you're creating width by taking away center strength and adding side strength. It actually is frequency dependent. So it works within particular frequencies so that the enhancement or the spread actually helps to enhance the positioning and musical, or well, I don't know if positioning necessarily, but it's very musical, the way that it kind of brings out the elements of instruments. I find that this happens to work really well when you let your mix to or master to smaller speakers. It seems to really help to enhance the frequency areas that helps that come out a bit more. So we'll play around a little bit with that. Over here in this section, so there's a few things we didn't go over. We'll just show you here. There's a compressor section here, which has a percentage control. So you could turn it off entirely, or you can run a percentage, sort of like a parallel mix. Goes from 100% down to like 86%. So there's kind of like a mostly mix. This helps you to preserve some of the transient energy, and you'll see gain reduction for left and right go down, spill down the sides here from the center. There's also a de-esser built in. You could solo there just to sort of hear what that's doing on that end. There's a compressor link, so we'll kind of spin back off to some of these. The harmonic distortion will just basically add, a warming characteristic. It usually helps to make a master sound more listenable. It'll kind of soften the transients a bit and control them in a more musical, warming kind of way. The output trim is just what the output of the overall limiter section will be. So this will be your final output level. And I'm going to get to the dynamic range meter here in a minute. In the top left here, we have a compressor link. This links the left and right channels. So if you're predominantly center driven in terms of which is most mixes, then keeping the link off will help to keep a little separation between the left and right. If you find that there is heavy information, sometimes you get this with EDM mixes and stuff like that, where getting a lot of side information, it may create some artifacts on the other side. So if you have something really heavy on the left, maybe creating pumping and breathing on the right that you don't like. So having this off may help, or having it on may help to kind of balance things out, so you don't have one side that's way over compressing and nothing going on the other side. So it gives you some options there. The turbo limiter, it's an output limiter stage, and this just throws another dB on there. So this will just, if you need to increase your loudness level, it's like throwing another loudness unit on top of the pile there by driving a little bit more limiting on the top at the very end stage. When you work with a compression, you have 4 options. This is the heaviest compression setup, and you have progressively lighter compression schemes that go here. So these are either combinations of different settings or thresholds. They also have different modeling technology. So the TMT technology, which models the tolerance percentages of different components, that's kind of built in here as well. So you get some slightly different coloration from each one of these setups. So whether the settings are the same with different thresholds, or whether they're slightly varied settings, you can get not just an amount of compression, but a basic characteristic sound from each of these. So you have to kind of toggle through them and go through that. So we'll demo that as well. Everything here, when you're working with the plugin, centers around the dynamic range control. So what you have is a green area here between 6 and 8. And so what you'll find is the majority of mastering work that you'll do, you'll want to kind of get your needle kind of operating somewhere in here. So this is managing the dynamic range. So the dynamic range can be defined in a lot of ways. The way they've defined it here is kind of like like a difference between the peak level and the RMS level. And that's like would be typically called like a crest factor. So there may be something slightly different in the way they define that, but that's more or less what it is. So that differential here at 6 is pretty loud, right? That's on the loud side, and if you want to go for a loud master, you're going to be targeting on this side of the 6 here. If you want something that has a little bit more dynamic range, which may be suitable for release on some of the streaming services where they have loudness standards that keep everything at the same volume. If you push too hard on the loudness, they're just going to pull your overall level, and you'll lose that a couple dB extra of dynamic range. On the top end, you may find that your masters sound lower in level, even though they're technically louder if you put them side by side in a DAW. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Where you start is by driving the volume here to get yourself in that green range to basically determine how much loudness you want on the lines there. You'll set the foundation for the overall low-high frequency balance of the mix. You could leave it just where it is if you like where you are, but you could push it one way or another, and then use the tone controls third here to kind of set the overall tonal balance, and you can throw in the resonant filters along the way if you find that you need to tighten up the low end or kind of help along those lines. So we'll start with that process. We'll finish off with some of the MS processing and output limiter stages, and go through some of the compression characteristics. And I'll sort of throw that in there with the THD. So there's actually quite a lot in here, right? But we'll start with this basically at minus 0.2, and we'll just kind of see where we drive in. So right now we're not adding anything. Let's see where our needle ends up here.
You went your way, and I went mine, drifting slowly down the road, walking a line, and all these cars are passing me by, and all these streets, they seem like a blur. It's like a blur. Running out of time, running out of reasons, running out of money, don't know what I was
So if you look at this here, you'll notice that what I was doing there was trying to get it. It doesn't move or respond right away because it's like the dynamic range is going to be something that occurs over time. So I'm kind of right there in the middle, and let's just see how this kind of goes as I start to put in compression and some of the other things. Now, if I want this to be off, I can just turn the compression completely off. You could already see that there's some gain reduction going on there. And I also balance this off at the output here. So what I can do here is, as we're working, I'm going to try to keep this unity gain so we can A/B the whole thing in and out. So if we start from here, let's just leave the compression off for the time being. Let's double check our dynamic gain and then go to the foundation control where we can set the balance between low end and high end.
You went your way, and I went mine. Drifting slowly down the road, walking a line. And all these cars are passing me by, and all these dreams, they seem like a blur. Just like a blur. Running out of time.
So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull it back just a touch because I'm going to work with some of the tone controls to sort of rebuild and tighten up a bit of the low end here. So I'm just going to shift it back a bit, but just so you could see here how with the foundation I can kind of push it warmer for something that's maybe a brighter master, or brighten it up, or by taking away some of the low end. So I'm not sure what the crossover point or actually what the design of this is. If it's sort of like a tilt shelf type of thing, where as you pull down on the low end, it raises the high end, and vice versa if you go the other direction. But whatever it is, it sets the basic overall tonal character that you're going to kind of build from with the tone controls. So let's start here, and I'll start playing in and see if I can start by focusing the low end. I'm going to start here with the bass control, and then maybe work over with a couple of the resonant filters on the low end, and start there first.
You went your way, and I went mine. Drifting slowly down the road, walking a line. And all these cars are passing me by, and all these dreams, they seem like a blur. Just like a blur. Running out of time, running out of reasons, running out of money, don't know what I was thinking. Trying to get away, trying to get back, trying to start again, trying to get back to living. Well, if it's not love, it's not bad. I'm
So it helps me to bring in a little bit more warmth on the low end and focus it a little bit better. This also has an auto solo control, so if I wanted to, I can hear exactly what it is that's going on here. The fundamental idea of this is to sort of, do a little resonant dip. And probably, I think it sounds like there's probably a little bit of a boost right below it to sort of tighten up the lower frequencies. So I'm not sure if the resonant ripple kind of goes across the boost line on the other side. But the fundamental idea about that is just to kind of create a focus point for the low end. I'm curious to know whether this is somewhat related to what you see on the Modus equalizer, or in the plugin form you call it the digital V3. If there's something related to that, because it has a low end in presence sort of rippling type of equalization that's in there that looks very similar to what this sounds like. Okay, so let's start a little bit with the top end. So what we have here is a mid-range boost. Just from my test, it seems like it's kind of boosting sort of a mid-presence area, probably mostly, softly between the 1K to 5K range. So it's probably centered somewhere in the middle there. It may be lower than that. This just was my initial perception. There's a treble, which to me seems a little bit like a tilt. That kind of brings EQ up, probably from a 2K range up a little bit higher. The presence seems to be more like a shelving EQ, probably set somewhere like around 10K, somewhere in that range. The boost and attenuations here are only plus minus 3 dB. So if you find yourself going with radical amounts or what looks like a radical amount just because of the knob position, don't be sort of taken back by that, because it's not necessarily an indication. If you think of it in terms of just plus minus 3 dB, that's more of a mastering range. That might be extreme in the mastering realm, where you might be within a dB on a lot of your settings there. But depending upon what you need to do to the master, let's see what the difference is between starting with the difference between the treble and the presence controls.
You went your way, and I went mine. Tripping slowly down the road, walking a line. And all these cars are passing me by, and all these streets, they seem like a play. Just like a play. Running out of time, running out of reasons, running.
So for this particular master, I kind of like the presence control here is a little bit smoother. This seems to be grabbing more mid-range, which I'm not liking. Let's see if I can get what I like out of here from the mids here.
You went your way, and I went mine. Tripping slowly down the road, walking a line.
I really like what that does to help bring out the vocal, kind of make it sit really solid. And that seems like a good frequency area that would pull mixes out in small speakers. So whatever that is, I like that right there. So let's see if we can, just from there, kind of do an overall balance here. Now we could take a look at the dynamic range here. The meter can show input and output here. So we'll see the dynamic range setting here.
You went your way, and I went mine. Tripping slowly down the road, walking a line. And all these cars are passing me by, and all these streets, they seem like a play. Just like a play. Running out of time, running out of reasons, running out of money, don't know what I was thinking. Trying to get
Okay, so that sounds really good. So starting up from there, I'm just going to work in a little bit of gain reduction here. Now, what they have is a starting point at 93%, which preserves a bit of the original dynamic, allows the natural existing transient to kind of cut through to some degree. So it's like a percentage control. So it's sort of like a form of parallel compression, but it's not like a 50-50 kind of thing. And it's not like you're getting excessive compression necessarily and mixing it from the bottom up. It's kind of like from the other direction, where you're just saying, okay, here's the compression, but let me just have, a little bit less of it and see if I can strike the balance between what's natural and what's there. We have the 4 different settings again with the TMT, and just notice the gain reduction plus minus here.
You went your way, and I went mine. Tripping slowly down the road, walking a line. And all these cars are passing me by, and all these streets, they seem like a play. Just like a play.
So in here, sometimes you can be driven a little bit more by the gain. It's slightly more gain on this, but I wanted to go for a little bit more of an aggressive sound. So I'm going to go with the number 1, although I like the number 4 setting as well. Now, you notice here that the gain reduction is leaning a little bit more on the left side than on the right side. Now, if I wanted to keep them even, I can link the left and right. And let's see what that sounds like in comparison to see if that collapses any of the work of the compression or not.
You went your way, and I went mine. Tripping slowly down the road, walking a line. And all these cars are passing me by, and all these streets, they seem like a play. Just like a play.
So to me, the compressor link out is a more open mix, which I kind of like. So I'm going to leave that in. And then we also have a turbo limiter section here. We'll get to that a little bit later. There's a couple things here. The THD, let's see if this can bring in a little bit of warmth into it. It defaults to a -60. You can turn it off. Let's see if we can swing in and find some kind of balance with it.
You went your way, and I went mine. Drifting slowly down the road, walking a line. And all these cars are passing me by, and all these dreams, they seem like a blur. Just like a blur. Running out of time, running out of reasons, running out of money, don't know what I was thinking.
So I really like what that does right in there. There's probably a lot more than what I would expect to go, but I kind of like where it sits tonally. I think there's a little bit of a harshness overall. I'm just going to use the de-esser to see if I can tone back a little bit of that here.
You went your way, and I went mine. Drifting slowly down the road, walking a line. And all these cars are passing me by, and all these dreams, they seem like a blur. Just like a blur. Running out of time, running out of reasons, running out of money, don't know what I was thinking. Trying to get away, trying to get back, trying to start again, trying to get back to living.
See, that's pretty transparent. It may not really need much of that. I'm not sure if I'm being a little bit overly sensitive to, but it could be worth a review. But I just wanted to at least show the de-esser in there. Also wanted to show the stereo enhance before we set our final levels at output. So let's see what that's like.
You went your way, and I went mine. Drifting slowly down the road, walking a line. And all these cars are passing me by, and all these dreams, they seem like a blur. Just like a blur. Running out of time, running out of reasons, running out of money, don't know what I was thinking. Trying to get away, trying to get back, trying to start again, trying to get back to living. Baby, it's not love, it's not bad. I'm trying to get back, best I ever had.
Okay, so I already have a pretty good hot level going on out there. Again, I just have this balanced out for A/B purposes here. I could probably spend a little bit more time monitoring my dynamic range, but also I could compare the input to output. I just wanted to set it up basically so we could do an A/B. You could see how it really opens up. I liked what this did here, only just a touch. As I moved it more, it seemed to over-enhance the guitars, which are already fairly loud in the mix. But overall, I like what it's doing there, just a touch there. I'm not sure, there's nothing really on the low end on this that can be pulled in, but let's just do a touch here. Maybe I can tuck in just under the guitars or at the low end of the guitars.
You went your way, and I went mine. Drifting slowly down the road, walking a line. And all these cars are passing me by, and all these dreams, they seem like a blur.
And it's a very subtle difference, but it does help a little bit there on the low end. Most of the original mix here is the low end, the bass and the kick drum mono, and not a lot of effect going to the side with low end. Let's put the turbo limit on, see if we can push this into the red a little bit.
You went your way,
as you can see here, the dynamic range meter is not following the output. It's following the difference between the peak and the level. So as I bring this down, it's not like this is going to change. And that's actually very cool. It's different from reading like loudness meters, which if you're just kind of dealing with getting your settings so that you can A B without a big level difference just with the bypass switch, then you lose that control kind of in there, or you end up with numbers that don't make sense really. Whereas maybe on a loud master you're talking to like -8 for LU. In usually loud masters range somewhere around there -8. If you go much hotter than that, it starts to get into heavy distortion at that point. And then you could push more, a little bit more open into the 9s or 10s. And so what I found here in just doing a little loudness unit measurement here with this turned up to -0.2, which it defaults when you hit the turbo mode. It's somewhere right in there, where that 6 is. So this is kind of in a pretty good place. I'm not sure I see a reason to really drive it a little bit more. But yeah, it's really cool. I really love the sound of this. It's simple. When you start to play with the foundation and the tone controls and the combinations of that with the high end, I didn't use the resonant filter on the top. Maybe this would help a little bit with that top end harshness. Let's check out the couple of settings there. Maybe I'm better off there than with the de-esser. So let's check that out.
You went your way, and I went mine. Drifting slowly down the road, walking a line. And all these cars are passing me by, and all these streets they seem like a blur. You went your way, and I went mine. Drifting slowly down the road, walking a line. And all these cars are passing me by, and all these streets they seem like a blur.
Could either one of those, I'm not sure which one I like better, but one of those definitely helps to pull back on some of the harshness. This is obviously getting at a little bit of the stuff in a little bit of a lower range, shifts the vocal in a different way than this one does. This adds like a nice presence to the vocal, which I kind of like, but overall the master is pretty present. You can see how there's a ton of options here. When you start to work with the combinations of all these, the tone controls and the foundation, there's a lot of options and a lot that you can work with tonally within this one plugin. You see a lot of the interaction here, and it's very easy to get like a very analog, warm, great and loud master if you want a loud master. So very powerful tool. I really like this. Been experimenting with it for a little bit now, just for the purposes of the demonstration, and really liking a lot of what I hear in it. And I do a lot of professional mastering work, so picking up something like this, even for a quick master, is really amazing. But as a solution for somebody who doesn't do mastering for a living, it's a great choice. Easily, hands down, the best sort of all-in-one choice with this simple of a graphic interface. Very cool one. Great work, as always, by brainworx. And a long demo here, but sort of worthy of it, just considering how much is kind of in there, even though it's a simple interface. Mixing with my plugin of the week, brainworx BX Master Desk.